Being the last speaker in the afternoon after so many good presentations is not very easy. I will try and take 20-25 minutes to give an Israeli perspective on what's going on. If periodically I'm provocative, it's just to keep you awake and nothing more. And I'll leave 5 minutes for discussion. I may annoy some of you, but I keep saying to myself, that's the prerogative of age. So I apologize in advance if so. I really want to look at what's going on in Israel in terms of gender and politics, but within the context of what was discussed up to now. And I want to comment on the comparison before I continue. And if you have anything to say, make faces, I can't see you anyway. And we'll talk about it later. Israelis love to compare what's going on in Israel today and in general to what takes place in the United States and Western Europe. And because Israel is undergoing a very severe process of democratic regression today, everybody is also looking at Poland and Hungary and some of the Central European countries. In my estimation, that's a grave mistake. Intellectually and academically, it says more about Israel and very little about what is happening in Israel and to Israel in the region. And therefore, any kind of comparative discussion has to be contextualized. And we have to remember that today, unlike 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, we are in a period of extraordinary global fluidity and uncertainty. And by the way, I didn't hear for 1 second even mention of climate change or COVID in this discussion, but it contextualizes a lot of the processes that were being discussed and should be discussed in Israel as well. And one has to place Israel within the region. And by saying to place Israel inside the region, I am referring primarily to the fact that since around the Arab Spring and until recently, there was extreme volatility in the region. There seems to be a renormalization taking place, which is being cemented as I'm speaking. And the stark divisions between Iranian bloc and a Shia bloc and a Sunni moderate bloc, moderate and these, okay, may be dissipating before our eyes. If Israel wants to be part of the region, and at the moment, the new renormalization is almost entirely excludes Israel. Has to be very careful about it, okay? Israel has to start seeing itself as part of what is going on and perhaps even learning a thing or two from what's going on around it and not just concentrating entirely on itself in Poland, for example, okay? That's a first major comment. The second major comment is, like some of the speakers before, I'm a political scientist and have a little passion for politics in many different ways. And therefore, I tend to think comparatively in many respects. And I apologize for talking a lot about politics, but for me, politics is not just formal politics. And I think Anwar made that point very, very clearly, but others did without using the language. Okay? Politics is everything that affects the public sphere, whether comes from civil society, which is very political in Israel today, perhaps the most political since the creation of the State of Israel, and also what happens in the formal sphere. And if we want to understand gender in politics, we have to insert gender into the political sphere, broadly conceived and not narrowly conceived. And therefore, with your indulgence, I'll give some of the elements of what's going on here, but I make two major, at this stage of the game, and I'm being very hesitant, I make two major claims. The first claim is that the interaction between gender and politics at the formal and informal levels together, gives us an indication of the dynamics of political trends in general. Not specifically for gender, but it is one of the key ways of understanding political patterns over time, here and elsewhere. I think the elsewhere was very clear from the discussions during the course of the day. That's number one. And number two, the way women organize and women's agency is a key indicator of future political trends, independently of what I said before. Follow women, you get a very clear picture. It's like a promo of what's going to happen a few years hence. So when we're looking at the two elements together, gender is a reflection and a signifier at the same time of political processes. Didn't I sound like a political scientist?
Very.
Absolutely.
You see, I still have it despite my activism. Okay. So let me look very quickly at the formal sector. That's the boring part. And then I'll look at the informal sector, which is what politics in Israel has become in the last 4 months. Okay? First, the formal sector, and again, I'm talking about gender and politics all the time, so you'll excuse me if I focus only on that. Men always block me. They never succeed. Okay? Never.
Some of them love you, know.
Thank you. You don't know how many men have tried. But let me hastily add, I can mention a few women as well. Toda rabba. There's a myth about Israeli women in politics, which has absolutely no relationship to reality since before the creation of the state and today. So get rid of the myths for a minute and let's talk about 2.5 types of, I'm now on the formal level of political representation. Israeli women's representation in elected office in the formal sphere has been until recently abysmal. Okay? Really comparatively very low for 40 years, almost 50 years actually. it never rose much beyond 10%, 12%, 11% once. And in the last 20 years, it's grown very rapidly, okay? Although it's tapered off in the last 3 years, if you're with me, okay? It rose until about the first round of the 4 rounds of elections, and since then it stalled. It went down in the last elections in November. The same goes with women in the government, ministers. There's always been 1, 2, 3 women in the government, ministers. That rose a little 20 years ago. It shot up with the Lapid-Bennett government. 9 women were ministers. That's the most we've ever had. But the number of ministers grew as well. We have this, if you haven't noticed, expansionist tendencies. Tarte mashma. And the result of that, in the last, in this latest government, there's a drop to about 5, I think. They keep adding these so-called ministers. A minister for gender equality that never proposed one law that promotes women's rights, for example. I think she's become the 6th minister. If you look in the economic sphere, you see the same pattern. A mild rise in the last 20 years and a flattening off in the last 5 years. But women as CEOs of major companies with economic power may be scratching 18 to 20%. If you want the figures and to keep up with the figures, look at the gender index published by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and most importantly, the key source on gender in Israel today is the digital platform called Yodaat, YODAAT.org, also from Van Leer. It's like a treasure chest for data and information. Put it all together. The descriptive representation of women, numerical, has improved a little, but Israel is somewhere between 69 and 79 on the world in the IPU ratings of women's representation. And it's formal, it's descriptive, it doesn't tell us much more than what Bosmat kept drumming away at us, but you see them. Never ignore seeing women in the public sphere. It has an amazing power on its own, okay? Mostly because a woman who didn't even know how to spell feminism, when she's elected, finds herself inundated with representation on the basis of the fact that she's a woman, and sometimes she succumbs. Not always. The most important thing is substantive representation, and that is representation of feminist, I insist, feminist values, okay? And the representation, the substantive representation in Israel is exactly the paradox that we're dealing with. There is no correlation between numerical representation and substantive representation. In the last Knesset, and definitely today, there are close to 30 members of Knesset with the Norwegians, Norwegians as those who went in. The Israelis will explain it later, not on my time, and I hope you're keeping time and you give me 7 minutes notice. There may be, I was up last night saying, how many of the close to 30 in the Knesset today could I describe as feminists? And I really had a hard time. I came up with 4 to 5, which is really a very low number. But if I did the same exercise for 10 years ago, I would still come up with maybe 20-25%. I don't like to talk about myself, but when I was in the Knesset, we were the same women for the same 3-term period in the 1990s. Altogether, there were, in a good period, 10 of us, and a bad period, one Knesset, there were 8 of us, 6 of whom were feminists. During that period, we went through every single law in the Israeli law books, and with a gender lens, and we simply changed the legislation. So Israeli legislation is very progressive. The reality is less progressive, but nevertheless, this gives you an indication of substantive representation. But I want to connect with what was said this morning and this afternoon. There's a new kind of substantive representation that's going on of women, which is not feminist, and in some cases it's counter-feminist. And I will start with the counter-feminist. We now have a group of women who are populist, extremists, fundamentalists.
True.
Not the only one. Yeah, there's a whole, if you want, we can go name by name. It's equal to the number
Except of
of,
Golan, the minister.
it's equal to the number of substantive feminists, okay? And that group, that uses the term Bat Melech. I didn't know how to translate it into English, but it means basically the word is a woman's role is in the house. Okay, that's the connotation of Bat Melech, and they are militant in that direction. They embody everything that really counters the notion of women in the public sphere, even though, as women in the public sphere, they preach that message. So there's a contradiction even in that sense. Much more interesting are religious Jewish women, some of whom are conducting internal revolutions. Some of them were hinted at in Egypt, for example, and Tunisia. It's taking place here as well. By the way, in Jewish and in Muslim society within Israel, it's much more interesting because they speak to the feminists, and they are probably the most effective of the anti-populist women that exist. So, substantively, we're getting nuances, and the nuances are reflective of something that I will describe in a minute, what's going on in civil society. So, on representation, there isn't one picture, and the formal picture, the nominal picture, is far different than the substantive picture, but the substantive picture is far different today than it was 20 years ago, because it reflects general political trends as well. Just 2 other comments on the formal level. Second element always look at is participation in decision making. And let me just say one very quick comment on that. If you think because you're elected that you have power, then you're thoroughly mistaken. And in an environment of democratic backsliding, you're wrong. You don't have power. If you look for where decisions are made, the absence of women becomes even more accentuated. It's magnified, okay? And that's in the economic sphere as well as in the political sphere, because to talk of power today without talking about economics is ridiculous. And the third point is that in a period of crisis, and here the crises are multiple. We've had health crises, economic crises, security crises, and now we're having a democratic crisis. In periods of crisis, the first victims, more than anybody else, are going to be women across the board. Then you could say Arab women more than Jewish women, Mizrahi women more than Ashkenazi women. You can break it down, okay? But the victims, the first, if you look at the women, you're going to see the victims. If you look at the women, you're going to see the change as well. So one has to look at both elements, and that's all formal politics. I didn't say anything that you didn't know, okay? Except for one thing that I'm going to make clearer now than I did before. The pattern in Israel, after 70 years of improvement in the status of women, is that there's a halt in the last 5 years, and in the last couple of years, there's actually a regression on almost every single indicator, that we know. There's just one catch to all of that. Men have also improved. So the gender gap continues, and in some cases has expanded. Again, counter to conventional wisdom. This is all provable. Look at the gender index. It'll give you the figures on it to back the analysis. Formal politics. But what's going on here now? Formal politics doesn't begin to give us the tip of the iceberg of a country that for the past 4 months has been in absolute turmoil, but has been in a state of political instability for quite some time. And not surprisingly, it's taking place in the streets. I saw the picture of the Iraqi demonstration, and I said, Kaplan. I mean, it's the same picture. It's the same picture. People are going out the streets. And where are the women in this process? We're beginning to analyze this. We don't have enough of the hard facts on the subject, but any of you who have perhaps visited one of these demonstrations at any time in the last 4 months knows that we're talking about 40 to 60% of participants are female, are women. And some of the key figures, Shikma Brester is one example, they're women. But we also know, and for that we don't need contemporary figures, because that I can give you chapter and verse on, civil society in Israel and progressive civil society in Israel, civil rights, human rights movements are, the activists are increasing, our majority of the activists are women, and increasingly the leaders are also women. If 30 years ago we had Association for Civil Rights in Israel, B'Tselem, Combatants for Peace, male leaders and female activists, you know that, okay, it's not true today. Again, over 50% of the key civil rights and human rights organizations today are actually managed by women. So you have an amazing women's presence in the movement. The one deviation of that, I would say, is the amazing mobilizing power of military service in the past 2 months. And that's generally a male-oriented element. But women, therefore, are not just reflective of the political processes, and their status is not just reflective of the political processes, but very clearly a pro-democratic leadership of immense power. But it works both ways, and I want to make it, I'm sorry, I'm going to go theoretical for 1 minute, no more. There are two elements to what's going on now. And sometimes we only see the top-down and the vertical element. What top-down is creating a bottom-up reaction, and the bottom-up reaction is creating a top-down reaction, and you're getting a lot of civil society versus government in one form or another going on. And again, Anwar pointed that out in Egypt very well. Something else is happening though, and that is there is a broadening of the horizontal range of what's going on politically in Israel today, with a fair amount of movement from what's known as a classic right position to a coming together of various ranges of center, center-left, left, and even moving to far left on this horizontal range. Look at the horizontal range. This is what Anwar called, for some reason, alliances. I'm not sure I like the term, but it's the same concept. And instead of arguing over terms, let's talk about the concept. There is a reordering of socio-ideological perceptions taking place in Israel, and it has not yet settled into a clear pattern. There's an element of it that's déjà vu. There's an element of that. Let's go back to the good old days, which I find, by the way, horrifying, because I can't remember good old days. Definitely not from a gender perspective. There's also, let's make some corrections, because we need to make corrections. We made a lot of mistakes in the past. At least that's healthy. And there's some that are putting their finger on the most critical point, and that goes back to the beginning of my presentation. Look, how can you even talk about democracy when you're ruling over and other people against their will for the past 56 years? So really, I, as a political scientist, I never understood that, okay? And it's so convenient to separate Israel, even today, Israel proper, That's the terminology here now, from the occupied territories, and to assume you can rectify the frailties of the Israeli neo-authoritarian tendencies today and ignore what's going on 20 minutes from where I live in Jerusalem. It's not doable. But what has happened now on the civil society level, and it's beginning to percolate upwards, and the role of women is very visible in that, is the understanding that if you talk democracy and you want to be consistent, you have to address the entire picture, not just the picture that's convenient for you. And therefore, a lot of the heavily women's political action at the civil society level in Israel today is shaking the underpinnings of conventional wisdom in the country in intriguing ways. Don't ask me how it's going to go because we're still in the midst of the process. But going back to comparative picture, this is exactly similar processes and patterns. What was described this morning on Tunisia, on Iraq, on Egypt, I missed somebody, but Yemen. And it totally resonated with me. And just think how much richer the analysis could be, but much more importantly, how much more profound our understanding of the processes that we're living in if we began to use these comparisons in order to understand where we're going. And I'll stop at this stage. Thank you very much. Oh, come on, I gave you so much to argue with.
I do have one thing.
So do I. But you first, of course.
Ladies first. So I was actually thinking about the comparison that you're making. I've been really in touch with people in Boston who are protesting what's happening on the ground. They're bringing the protests to the U.S. And I'm noticing a lot of influence of not just Israelis in the diaspora, but Jewish communities in general, and their role in helping facilitate certain stuff with the protests and bringing the news outside and pressuring as well. So I think that's one element that I'm interested in looking at that I think might be a bit different than other Arab countries and Arab contexts, is the role of not just Israeli diaspora but Jewish communities in general in kind of shaping how the world perceives that as well.
Yeah, I'll respond very briefly because all of us are looking at that, obviously. But just with a number of very quick points. Number one, 95% of Jews outside of Israel are living in democratic, liberal countries today. That's a revolution in many respects. And they very much link their Jewish identity with liberal values. They can't disconnect it at this stage. It's very clear in North America, but it's also true to a large extent. It's also true to a large extent in Europe and in English-speaking countries. And let's call it veteran democratic societies. That's number one. Number two, it's ridiculous. I thought I made it clear, but I'll say it in different words again. You cannot disconnect what's going on in Israel, or for that matter, in Yemen, or in Oman, or in Morocco, from what's going on outside. And all of these countries have their diasporas. And because the diasporas are very vocal in the intellectual and cultural world, and also hotbeds of political activity as well, there's going to be constant interchange about that as well. And that's what you're beginning to see. I'll just give you two examples. Netanyahu can't talk now to any major gathering of world Jewry because he's afraid to be heckled. It's as simple as that. He's always busy when he was supposed to speak to the General Assembly of North American Jewish Federations or even to the World Zionist Congress. Amazing. Think about it. On the one hand. On the other hand, whenever Israel is rebuked or criticized, then it gives the present government an opportunity to berate the critics as well. So it's, if you love me, we'll embrace you, and if you hesitate and have reservations, we'll attack you in that. Israel's no different than Egypt under Sisi and others. And you're right. This is a global world. When you get down to the minutiae, there are always going to be differences. But if you're pinpointing the differences, then you're losing what you can get in comparative analysis because you're losing the process and the pattern.
What bothers me, what worries me, is that in the short term, in all these cases, including Tunisia, not to mention Syria, after so much blood being spilled, and Egypt, what you have is the most horrific autocratic government, dictatorial government. So, now in my talk yesterday, I pointed out that you have to, if you look historically at popular revolutions, it took 20 years, 100 years in the case of France, 20, 30 years in America, whatever, until things got better. But at the moment, you know, I'm with you. If we compare the, I don't know, the Israeli Spring, I hate that term, but the Arab Spring, but the popular revolutions in the Arab world to the popular revolution here, I'm worried.
But that's what one of the things I really wanted to do is force myself, not just you, to say, look at Israel at 2023 in comparison to Egypt or Tunisia in 2011,
Yeah.
and learn your lessons, or some of them. And one of the lessons is precisely what you just said. You don't have to be gratified from doing comparison. You have to learn from the comparison. And therefore it's like a warning signal. And yes, did you think as an Israeli citizen who has never been totally mainstream, we've known each other for a long time,
Yeah.
as colleagues at the Hebrew University, did you ever think that you would be living in a situation that we're living in now? And the answer is no. And if we didn't see it, it's our mistake, because we weren't looking at in the right places. And therefore, I'm saying this is an intellectual void or frailty, and it's correctable. So now we can be a little harder.
But we have a unique, because among the fundamentalists, Anada in Tunisia and in Egypt, there are always women. Only in Israel, the fundamentalists, the religious party, do not have any women there.
No.
That's unique.
No, the religious parties do.
The ultra-Orthodox in Israel, there's not even one Knesset member.
The ultra-Orthodox don't have members of Knesset, women members of Knesset. They have a very intriguing, the Charedim, Charediot actually, a very intriguing movement.
Yeah.
But,
Not in the Knesset, why?
not in the Knesset, because all our efforts to make something in that direction, but from that point of view, we're worse off.
But then the difference, because in Nahda in Tunisia, there were women.
No,
Also
no,
in-
yes,
also in
but
the-
Wrong comparison.
But you,
Excuse me, the Haredim are like the Salafis. The Haredim are not like the.
What's the
Nahda.
difference between them?
There's
yeah,
a big difference.
because here you have the National Religious Party in
Right.
Otzma Yehudit
No, no.
having a fair number of women
Yeah.
that, and you have that in Nada.
Talking
in
about
the-
Chazan.
Nahda,
No, no, I'm talking about Chazan.
And that's why I'm saying, sometimes Israel doesn't come out well from the comparison.
Right.
If that's a point
It's
you're
not
trying to make.
It's not a pretty
that-
picture.
Sorry?
It's not a pretty picture. When you look at the comparison, it's not pretty. It doesn't.
It's that, and that's why
So
forcing,
Nahda is better.
in many respects, yes.
Nahda
It's better than- better than Chazan.
It's better, yes.
It's better than
Nahda.
Chazan.
No, no.
At least on record, I'm
Yeah.
not sure, yeah.
Yofi.
Yeah.
And
No,
the
maybe
point
not
is,
us, but yeah,
keep
that's wrong.
arguing and keep studying. And the more you go into depth about what I was pointing at, hopefully, I can't do such research, in-depth research these days because I can't see a thing, but it's these kind of questions that should be really occupying us, and we have the tools. And I'm not talking about quantitative and modeling, that's easy, that's technical, it's not theory. It's the kind of questions that we pose and what we do with them that can open up amazing doors for us, and we should use it, that's all I'm saying.
Well, thank you very
Thank you very much.